Hello, and welcome to On Air with Akin Gump. I'm your host, Jose Garriga. In this special Women's History Month edition of On Air, you'll get a chance to hear a webinar sponsored by Akin Gump's Women Firmwide Resource Group that features 3 standout Akin Gump women as they discuss the Biden-Harris administration's agenda and how issues impacting women may be addressed by the new administration. Labor and Employment Partner Esther Lander, and Public Law and Policy Partner Arshi Siddiqui and Senior Advisor and former Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen bring to the discussion their experience working on issues affecting women, whether on Capitol Hill, at the Department of Justice, or with the firm's clients. Welcome to the podcast. You'll first hear from Funds Partner and Women FRG co-head Barbara Niederkofler, who will introduce and moderate the panel.
Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Niederkofler, and I am joined with our panelists. I'd also like to introduce you right away to Arshi Siddiqui. We want to thank you for joining our Women's History Month program today, which will focus on what we can expect from the Biden-Harris administration on issues that impact women.
And before we get to our panel, as co-chairs of the Women and Asian Firmwide Resource Groups, we just did want to take a moment just to recognize the violence that we've seen in the country in recent weeks. We just last night in Denver, tragically, as we get more details, and then as well as what has happened in Atlanta last week, we are just, as a firm, as the leadership that our chair, Kim Cooper-Smith, has given to us in terms of really recognizing the challenge our country faces, we did want to recognize that predominantly some of these things are really impacting women, particularly what we saw in Atlanta last week.
So in addition to our sorrow and anger, we are also united in our opposition to any form of discrimination, hate, or violence against any group. Nearly 3,800 incidents against the Asian American and Pacific Islander community were reported over the course of roughly a year since the start of the pandemic, according to research released by reporting forum Stop AAPI Hate.
And COVID has been particularly aggressive in terms of how it has impacted the Asian American Pacific Islander community in terms of these types of incidents. And then on top of that, when you look at the impact on women, women made a far higher share of the report, 68%. So in that regard, we would like to just flag for the group that there is also some extremely effective training, bystander training offered by Hollaback. And this type of training basically can apply to any circumstance and gives us kind of a best protocols, operating procedures in terms of witnessing any sort of harassment or discrimination, from direct confrontation to taking out our phones and recording incidents to checking in on victims afterwards to ensure that they're okay.
Again, we encourage you to take the training. Kim's last message also included additional resources for anyone interested in learning more about these incidents. With knowledge and action, together we can prevent these kinds of incidents against anyone. I would like to now turn to our panel. We're so pleased to welcome our colleagues, Labor partner Esther Lander, former U.S. Representative Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, and Arshi Siddiqui, former senior advisor and counsel to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, to lead us through what the Biden-Harris administration could mean for the future of women's rights. A little background on our speakers. Esther previously served as the principal deputy chief of the Employment Litigation Section with the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Her practice focuses on high-stakes workplace, internal and governmental investigations, and complex employment discrimination claims. Ileana served for almost 3 decades as a member of Congress representing a congressional district in South Florida and was the first Hispanic woman to serve in Congress. As a woman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, she became a leader in crafting U.S. foreign policy. She served as the committee's chairwoman and chair or co-chair of multiple subcommittees. With more than 20 years of public and private sector experience, Arshi, who served as senior advisor and counsel to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, now works with companies to anticipate, understand, and navigate complex legislative and regulatory challenges. She focuses her practice on synthesizing policy and politics into viable legislative strategies. We have a full agenda, so let's just dive right into our questions. But I also wanted to note that participants can submit questions or comments in the Q&A for the panelists, which will be moderated by Teresa Harrison, co-chair of the Women's FRG Business Services. So, as a starting point, how would you characterize the Biden-Harris administration's approach to women's rights and policies impacting women?
Well, I'll start with that. And thank you so much, Barbara, for doing this. And thank you to everyone at Akin Gump. I'm proud to be in a firm that makes statements like the ones that Arshi just articulated, but acts on those statements. So proud of our chair, Kim Cooper-Smith, and that kind of leadership from the top permeates the whole Akin Gump familia. So thank you for all of that. Troubling times. Well, I think the key to understanding what the women's agenda would be for the Biden-Harris administration is the fact that it's called the Biden-Harris administration. It's very much a part of the focus. I think there's a great understanding throughout the administration that they are there, thanks in large part to the enthusiastic turnout of women voters. And progressive women especially have asked a lot of the Biden-Harris administration, and I think that they will expect a lot. And I think that's a heavy burden for the Biden-Harris administration. Why is it a heavy burden? Not because they don't want to do it, but because they're faced with this political reality that is the U.S. House of Representatives demographics and the U.S. Senate ratio. In the U.S. House, because of the vacancies, because Biden-Harris have tapped some top people from the House to be part of the cabinet, they are looking at right now, Speaker Pelosi has 219 Democrats. And when this last Republican that just got elected, when her husband died, 212 Republicans. So 219 to 212 with 4 vacancies. And vacancies take a little bit of time to get the elections going. And the Senate, forget about it. The Senate is 50-50 with Vice President Harris breaking the tie. But remember, it's not really a majority vote in the Senate because of the filibuster. You really need 60 votes. So high expectations of what the Biden-Harris administration wants to pass for the women's agenda, which is everybody's agenda, but the crushing reality of the makeup of the House and Senate is a pretty hard and high burden for them and hurdles. So Arshi has been in the thick of battle there in the House, and I'm interested in hearing her thoughts. But maybe lots of executive orders, but legislation passed, it's going to be tough. Arshi?
So, Congresswoman, I'm very excited because today is the day. Usually you are the one that's the optimistic ray of sunshine. And I feel like I'm a little bit more optimistic on this question. So I'm happy about that one. In terms of, because taking a step back, this is still very much a new day in Washington on the Democratic side, in the sense that, turning the page from President Trump was certainly a big milestone. The second piece is that, exactly as the Congresswoman stated, there are very tight margins, but we still are in a situation where there is unified Democratic control. I would say that those races in Georgia were a game changer. Actually getting to 50 in the Senate plus the VP Harris with 51 does change the landscape. But exactly as Ileana said, it's challenging terrain. I think there are kind of 3 or 4 pieces I would flag here in terms of relevant to our discussion today. One is very much the president and the vice president. They have the bully pulpit. They have the platform to highlight issues. They also have the agencies at their disposal. So as Ileana mentioned, the executive order piece of this is critical. I think there's also a piece on personnel as policy. So if you look at this cabinet, there's the highest number of women in the cabinet to date in history. So I think that is one big step forward, because in Washington, titles matter, but people matter more. And I think that is a place where we see that at the top with Vice President Kamala Harris in terms of the message it sends to the country and to little girls all over the country. And then I think we saw on the executive order, I'll just flag two, just to flag for the group, is we saw an executive order establishing the Gender Policy Council. And that was significant, I think, in the way it was staffed in terms of two very senior individuals who are well-versed in the ways of Washington. And then also another executive order guaranteeing the educational environment is free from discrimination based on sex. So I think those are examples of how the landscape is certainly changing, but absolutely, as this administration unfolds, it's not going to be all smooth sailing.
I know that there's a lot of activity on the Paycheck Fairness Act. Esther, what do you see there?
Yeah, so as background for those who don't know, the Paycheck Fairness Act would be an amendment to the Equal Pay Act. The Equal Pay Act dates back to 1963. And some of the shortcomings of the Equal Pay Act are that in order to establish a violation, a woman and a man have to be working in the same establishment, and that's been interpreted by the courts to be literally the same building or the same complex of buildings. And there's a defense to a pay disparity that is based on any factor other than sex. So it doesn't matter if it's a reasonable factor, it's just some reason that isn't because you're a woman and he's a man. So the act that it was actually reintroduced by Democrats in the House on January 28th, would expand the geography for comparisons of male and female pay to be broader. So it would no longer have the same establishment would be defined to include the same county or political subdivision for pay comparisons. And there are a number of other changes. The reason for a pay disparity would have to be justified by a bona fide factor other than sex, not just any factor. And the amendment grafts the disparate impact provisions of Title VII, where that means that the reason has to be job related and consistent with business necessity. And then the employer could prevail with that showing unless the plaintiff can demonstrate that there's another practice that would eliminate the disparity that the employer refuses to adopt. And then a lot of the other protections of the act really mirrors what the states are doing, which is prohibiting the employers from considering prior salary when setting pay or asking about it, prohibiting retaliation against employees who want to discuss their pay openly or inquire about their pay, strengthening the remedies to include punitive damages and compensatory damages, because the Equal Pay Act is an amendment to the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is essentially a back pay statute. So long and short of it is, it's a comprehensive amendment that would put a significant amount of teeth into the Equal Pay Act. And I think it's not likely to get passed in its current form. It's quite aggressive as written to make it into law. It's been introduced in every Congress since 1997. But to the extent that there's any hope, this was probably the administration to work a deal and get at least some of those protections enacted.
And along those lines, Vice President Harris has a strong record of commitment to women's equality, as demonstrated by her progressive proposals on equal pay and paid family and medical leave, reproductive rights, and maternal health. What do you think Vice President Harris's leadership and engagement on these issues could mean for women moving forward?
I think that her leadership is, this is where she's really going to shine. I mean, she's been an outstanding AG in California. She's been an incredible senator, but now that as Arshi says, she's got the bully pulpit. She really is going to stand out on women's issues. She's been doing it her whole life, and Arshi pointed out what a great role model all of this diverse cabinet and diverse everywhere in the Biden-Harris administration will mean. It's important to have role models. And I think that VP Harris is going to be standing out when it comes to the women's agenda, which I mean, we just use that term to get a handle on it, but it's everybody's agenda. And I think once this COVID pandemic enables us to have face-to-face meetings and have rallies and get large gatherings, I think you'll see a lot coming out from her mouth and the signature of the president on many executive orders. There'll be a lot of action on women's issues, and they're at the forefront. If President Biden is smart, and he is, to use her, she will be a standout role model, and will have a pivotal role in advancing the legislation that the Biden-Harris team is desirous of.
Yeah, just building on Ileana's comments, I would say a couple of things. Is one, I think that is really critical is that President Biden agreed to a model that began in the Obama administration. And that was a pretty simple practice, is that when the president was in the room, President Obama making decisions, Joe Biden was there as well. And that type of partnership really strengthened over the course of his term. And similarly, the now President Biden has made that commitment to Kamala Harris as well. So she is in the room, and being in the room at those critical points and really offering that insight and guidance, and just having that ability to really make your case at pivotal moments is really critical when you look at how strategy is developed in Washington and how at the end of the day deals are cut. So I think from that perspective, the vice president is uniquely situated, in addition to everything else that the Congresswoman highlighted in terms of her personality, her presence, and her ability to really connect with individuals and families. The other piece that I would also want to flag is, we talked a little bit about the current makeup in Washington. And when you look at that, the 50 votes in the Senate, for most things, you need 60 votes, thus the intense debate on filibuster reform. But there is kind of one way that increasingly both Republicans and Democrats have looked to in recent years on big, high-profile legislation. The Republicans used it in tax reform a few years ago, and now the Democrats just used budget reconciliation rules to fast-track the American Rescue Plan through Congress. So what that allowed Democrats to do was to fast-track a bill through the Senate and pass the bill without Republican support, given that there was a divide on how to approach COVID, stamping out COVID. So I think from that perspective, I think she also is playing a leadership role in the Senate that under normal circumstances she would not, but she did serve in the Senate, of course, and now she is deciding pivotal votes like she just did with the American Rescue Plan.
With the caveat, I so agree 100% with what you said, Arshi, but it's important for our audience to understand that it is the Senate parliamentarian who really defines what the lanes are for reconciliation. For example, the $15 minimum wage hike, the parliamentarian ruled that could not be part of the reconciliation package. I mean, the real set boundaries of what can be on the bill and what can't be. And so I think that the Biden-Harris administration will be, they're already experts in what they can do through reconciliation. And you'll have the Republicans very much opposed to any changes in the filibuster, and opposed to trying to get all of these bills through using reconciliation. So Minority Leader McConnell understands these arcane Senate rules, and I think it'll be a bloody fight and on the Senate floor if they try to undo that filibuster rule. We shall see. But that's a way to get a lot of these women bills through. I agree with you, Arshi.
No, and actually, Ileana, I think that was a really good point, because I think that on a lot of the policies that we're talking about in terms of as they relate to women, reconciliation will be a really tough hill to climb. That I'm glad you made that clarification. I think it's the one piece I was going to say is that as we look at an infrastructure rebuilding package, there will be a more global effort on what they can pass. And the question is that, can you meet the rules of reconciliation, which basically, as kind of a shorthand, they have to have some sort of fiscal impact. And if they don't, it's very hard you can't get them in. And in addition to the fiscal impact, extraneous details are not allowed. So thank you for raising.
Esther, there's a lot here that will impact workplaces. What's your sense about employers' readiness for some of the potential changes?
Well, it depends on the law and how much it's going to cost. And some employers are in a better situation to absorb the cost of change than others. Large employers versus small employers who have been particularly hard hit by COVID. One bill, for example, that again was reintroduced, that again has been around for many years, is the Family Act, which would provide paid leave. Right now, the FMLA is an unpaid leave statute that provides basically job security. Employees and their loved ones or close relations, individuals to the employee who have serious health conditions, which spans pregnancy as well as adoption, can take 12 weeks of unpaid leave and still get their jobs back. And what this bill would change is that employees would be eligible for 60 days of paid leave, capped at $4,000 a month, and it would be 2/3 of their pay per pay period, something like that. And what's interesting about this particular approach in the bill is that the paid leave would be administered by the federal government, by a new arm of the federal government, a new agency that would be developed. And the money would be collected through payroll taxes, just like Social Security. It's like a 0.2% tax, and it would be both the employee contributing and the employer matching. So whether that will gain any traction at this point, based on the new composition of the Senate and the House, I'd have to defer to my other co-panelists. But at least it's a way of sharing the cost of that benefit that's spread out between the employee and the employer, with the administration burden on the government.
That was a great explanation. Thank you, Esther. I think that with this COVID problem being, of course, a health crisis, but it's also an economic challenge, it will be difficult for Republicans to think, hey, this is the time to get paid family leave or extend more protections and more pay for businesses. I think it's going to be a tough sell, even though, as I'm sure we'll be talking about, how COVID has impacted women disproportionately in a terrible way. But it's going to be a tough sell to move that agenda item through the Senate. The House, anything is possible. Speaker Pelosi has a very good hold on her Democratic caucus members, and she doesn't need to have a hold. I mean, they're with her. It's a very moderate to progressive left-leaning caucus. So she doesn't need to convince them. They're there already. What she needs to do is see how she can get it with a little bit of bipartisan support. You know, if you just get one, then you say it's bipartisan. So that's all. That would be great if a lot of these bills could get at least one Republican vote, please. Arshi, go ahead. What do you think the chances are to get some of this?
I think you hit it right. I mean, I think the challenge in the Senate is that on paid leave is that it's a tough hill to climb. So the question really is would Democrats be willing to compromise in a way that that attracted Republican support? And I think your analysis is accurate right now. We've seen COVID so politicized in terms of these packages, in terms of the size and scope. And I think when you look at the various packages that passed, a number of them with significant bipartisan support, but the sticking point across the board between Democrats and Republicans has been the size, basically the level of government or private sector involvement. And so I would say that that divide will continue, and with margins as tight, it's just very difficult. But I think one area that I think we could, that's the other thing just to kind of close out, is that the great thing about Washington is when things align properly, a lot of different things can happen. And I think COVID has been a great example of where women's roles have really come to the policy forefront in terms of the burden and the responsibility that women have kind of borne during this crisis. So I am cautiously, there's like a sliver of hope that all the stars could align on this and Congress could come to something.
Well, you have taken some optimistic medicine. What's happened here? Go ahead, Esther, you were going to say something.
I was just going to say that one thing that the COVID relief packages have shown is that it's possible to actually have some form of paid leave, because that's what the COVID packages provided in certain circumstances. And, pay for it through tax credits and other ways based on the size of the employer. So, maybe there's a way I should be in Congress, because I feel like I could rewrite this in a way that would get bipartisan support. But, I've never been in Congress like you guys, so I'm more rosy-eyed, perhaps.
I mean, our challenge is that we've lost so many of the moderates that, who know how to get, things done. So Akin Gump's, gain with Ileana was Congress's loss in terms of that type of personality and profile.
But you are so right, Arshi and Esther, when you talk about the moderate wing of the GOP, and maybe we'll have time to talk about that later, but more and more conservatives are being elected on the Republican side, so that the ideological divide between the Democrats and Republicans has gotten more pronounced. It's almost cartoonish how you can describe the Republicans and the Democrat side. It's just polar opposites. And so the moderation and the reaching across the aisle, oh my gosh, those are bad phrases. A lot of people talk about it, but when you see it in implementation, there's very little that is getting done in a bipartisan manner. It is such a shame, the polarization of Congress. Sorry.
I think Congresswoman had mentioned the impact on women. So I thought we could shift gears and just briefly talk about the statistics. So the pandemic has resulted in more than 2.5 million women compared to 1.8 million men leaving the U.S. workforce since the start of the pandemic, which risks setting back progress made with gender equality in the workforce. We know this trend isn't happening voluntarily. Women are disproportionately impacted by job loss, closed schools, lack of childcare, pay disparity, and lack of public policies to support working women. What is the Biden-Harris administration doing in the short term to stop the exodus of women leaving the workforce, including through the recent $1.9 trillion stimulus?
Yeah, I think that when you look at the American Rescue Plan, that reality had really hit home. And I think that was also a result of, this was a plan that, we talk a little bit about this in terms of there being a divide between Republicans and Democrats on how to address the pandemic. And so because on the Democratic side, we have had such an influx of women, we saw the paid leave that Esther mentioned. I mean, that was included in this past package. It also included a tax relief for employers to soften the blow during these difficult times. There was $39 billion for childcare, nearly $24 billion for childcare stabilization grants, CDBG block grants for kind of childcare and state kind of block grants that really focused on this challenge that so many mothers were facing during the pandemic. And I think even more aggressive in that regard, we saw some really significant tax policy on the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit. And the numbers of children taken out of poverty in this package is pretty stunning. The challenge, I think, and then also expansion of the child and dependent care tax credit. So it was a whole host of tax policy and block grants that were given to the states, and then also healthcare and nutrition. So I think there was a real recognition in this time of crisis that Democrats wanted to focus on basically helping those who had been disproportionately impacted and been left behind. And for that reason, I think the challenge long term is that now that we're past this crisis moment, and that kind of brings our conversation full circle in many regards, because the only reason that the American Rescue Plan was able to pass were two reasons. Was one, the wins in Georgia did create 50 votes in the Senate. Kamala Harris gave the 51st vote via reconciliation, in the sense that the American Rescue Plan was passed through the Senate using reconciliation. So I think what that leaves us with is that when these provisions expire, when the funding is exhausted, then what happens long term, where some of these issues were temporary, but some of these issues are going to linger. And I think that goes to Ileana's and I's kind of discussion about this being tough when you look at the tight makeup in Congress.
I agree with what you say, Arshi, and many analysts have looked at this recently passed and implemented bill as being up to par with the revolutionary laws that FDR passed in the tough economic times of the Depression. So this is going to be studied for a long time into how wide the scope of this bill was and what an impact it could have on people's lives. Perhaps that's why Republicans did not embrace it. It was just they saw it as too expansive. And you bring up COVID and the impact that it has had on so many groups, and it really has brought to the forefront the health disparities and the economic disparities that exist with women and with minorities. You see that how Blacks have been severely impacted, how Hispanics have been negatively impacted by COVID, and Native Americans, and you name it, every minority group has been hurt the most by COVID. And it's going to take a long time for those communities to bring themselves up to where they were just a year and a half ago. So recovery takes time, and I think those at the top have been doing okay, and those at the bottom have been greatly struggling. And women are on there in that group, even though we're not a minority, we're a majority. But also we have seen how the tax code has been written in such a way that it favors certain groups and disfavors others. A very progressive Congresswoman Katie Porter of California has brought up the fact that in this bill, she was not able to change that part of the tax code that benefits married couples with children. And she's a single mom with 3 kids, and she's not getting she would not be getting as much money back as the married couple. So she says, I'm not going to put up with this is how it's always happened, and this is the way we always do it. So you're going to see a lot of changes in all varieties of laws related to how COVID has impacted these groups.
Yeah, and Ileana, I think that's a really important point that you made on communities of color, because I think when you look at frontline workers and you look at how COVID impacted underrepresented groups, the numbers are stunning. And I think it really has had a policy impact, particularly across the Democratic Party. So when you look at this administration, I think in the past, we've often seen, even in the Democratic Party, lip service to helping communities of color. I think, there has been a really thoughtful and aggressive approach by the Biden team and the members in Congress who represent these communities.
Biden-Harris.
Yes, there you go. Thank you, Ileana. Biden-Harris, and the members in Congress who are also pushing. So I do think that's a significant shift for the better, and will have long-term impact on the policymaking process.
So let's shift gears away from COVID. So on International Women's Day, President Biden issued an executive order establishing a White House Gender Policy Council that will develop and submit a government-wide strategy for advancing gender equity and equality in the US and globally, and to report publicly on its annual progress. This is a big undertaking, particularly with regards to aligning agencies and other councils. What are some of the key areas of focus for the council?
I think they are going to take an exhaustive review, and I think it is a very serious effort. I mentioned kind of the way that they have staffed this at the top. I think also having one of the individuals is a former chief of staff to Joe Biden, and I think anybody who watches the president knows what an important figure Joe Biden is to the president. So I think from that perspective, I think that they're going to take a pretty exhaustive approach in prioritizing and really creating a comprehensive plan going forward. I also think it's significant in terms of, this was something that they focused on early, and it's something that they have already started to have discussions about. So I think we can expect good things, and it's a good platform to set the agenda that can then be also taken up by Congress. But I think we're still in the early stages of this, and these things tend to have a life cycle and a trajectory of their own. But going back to the staffing aspect, I think that's what gives me hope that this might be a good, viable vehicle for some real progress.
Yes, Arshi, I agree. And I think that this is one of the areas where you could have a lot of the female senators, where we have a lot of GOP women senators who have made the women's agenda part of their legislative agenda. You have forward-thinking senators like Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia. There are a lot of GOP women who are not in lockstep with their Republican Party, and they're more willing to step out in front to advance women's causes that they see as righting this gender imbalance that we see in all sectors of society. So I think that this may be an area where we could have bipartisan support.
On the employment front, there's a crisscross of employment statutes that are enforced by different administrative agencies. You have the EEOC, the Department of Labor, and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. And on this, the White House Policy Council on Gender that was developed is supposed to be forming a working group that includes representatives from all of those different agencies on the employment front to discuss interagency cooperation and how the law is interpreted, the various laws, and they intersect and overlap. and on enforcement priorities. And we saw this in the Obama administration with the Equal Pay Task Force. There was a White House Equal Pay Task Force when I was in the Civil Rights Division. And what grew out of that was a directive on how OFCCP was going to investigate employers for pay violations. And that actually was vetted through all the different agencies and has a lot of overlap with how Title VII is going to be interpreted consistently with how OFCCP is enforcing pay issues. That, of course, has since been rescinded with the Trump administration, and it'll probably come back. And we see this every time the administration goes Democrat or Republican on some of these executive orders and interpretations. But I do think there's going to be more interagency cooperation and coordination with specific strategic plans and enforcement priorities that are aligned across agencies.
Yeah, Esther, I think that's a really excellent point, particularly given everything that the administration is dealing with on COVID and rebuilding the economy. This very easily could have gotten lost in the cracks in terms of, coordinating between these agencies. Because as we discussed, the departments and the regulations and executive actions are kind of one of the strongest tools that the Biden-Harris administration has. And often you can see two things. As one is that they're conflicting approaches, or there's not enough coordination in terms of a cohesive approach. And I think the other piece that this also does is when you have a platform, an organizational platform like this, it also spurs other agencies to, get their act together and kind of move forward when they see other agencies are moving forward as well. So I think from that perspective, given the timing, I think that's an excellent point.
All right, well, just circling up on something that we mentioned earlier, record numbers of women, especially diverse women, ran for Congress in 2020. So I just wanted to go through those numbers again. In 2019, 127 women held seats in Congress. Now in 2021, there are 144 women serving. In addition, around 120 women, including 48 women of color, were elected to the House in 2020. I know we've touched on this, but do you think that these increases are significant enough to impact progress with respect to women's rights?
Absolutely. I would say yes. When I was first elected to Congress in 1989, I was the 13th Republican woman elected for that year. When I left almost 30 years later, I was the 13th Republican woman in the U.S. House. Wow, that is just dismal, horrible. But when things change, they really start to change. Now we have a record high number of women GOP members in the House, still far less than what we should have, but things are changing. So once that revolution starts, it really is hard to stop. And why is it important? Because we understand a lot of these issues perhaps in a more personal way and a more family-oriented way than our male counterparts. And that's a generalization. There are many exceptions to that, but women are seen by the voters as someone who is more moderate. That's why it's hard for Republican women to get elected many times, because they lose in the primary. Why? Because the Republican voter says, I'm a conservative, I'm a Trump Republican, and there's this woman and there's a guy, and they'll think the guy's more in my conservative way of thinking. So it's tough for Republican women to go through the primary and win. But we have great leaders like Elise Stefanik. She's a Republican congresswoman from upstate New York, and she formed her own PAC because leadership was not helping her. And she says, I am going to get involved in Republican primaries and elect more women through the primaries where they need the help the most. And now GOP leader Kevin McCarthy has seen the wisdom of Elise Stefanik's ways, and he's going to get more involved in trying to get recruitment up and helping women through these tough primaries. We need to diversify our party. We just can't be a bunch of angry white guys. There's a whole there's a whole country there, and we need to be more representative of that country. So I'm bummed out that we haven't made enough progress, but I'm optimistic. I'm getting the Arshi syndrome. I'm the optimist. I don't know why I've been so pessimistic today. I didn't have a good enough breakfast, but the GOP is finally coming into the 19th century. Hey, we're going to get it eventually, and we're doing better. But having more women, does it make a difference? It sure does. Right, Arshi? Right,
yeah,
Esther?
Absolutely. I feel like we're doing a little bit of role reversal today, Ileana. So I think that's what's going on. I mean, I think on the Democratic side, it's been a game changer. And actually it's so significant. Ileana made a comment about, not a woman's agenda isn't necessarily just a woman's agenda, it's everybody's agenda. And I really do think that the shift in terms of the makeup of Congress, both in terms of ethnicity and gender, has been so significant, and age. So I think there is a generational shift going on in Washington, and the way that these newer members function with each other, function with their constituents, it has shifted significantly. And now having this many women, it has just become normalized in the Democratic Party. And so where in the past, when I was coming up as a staffer, there were very discrete women's issues. And now I think we are kind of transitioning in the Democratic Party to more of these issues just being core to the discussion and the debate, and prioritized on the agenda in a way that I just haven't seen before.
The SEC
Esther, I don't know if you wanted to add something to that. We didn't mean to hog it up.
Nope, yeah. I have nothing to add on that point.
Esther, though, I do have a question for you, and that is that the SEC also requires public companies to disclose information and data that may be important to investors and shareholders of the company, including how board members self-identify with specific diversity characteristics such as race, gender, ethnicity. Do you see this requirement pushing public companies to be more transparent and improve the representation of their boards?
So board members are not employees. So they are not protected or subject to employment laws that govern discrimination. What that means is that companies can purposefully compose their board by taking race and gender into account when selecting board members. And given the transparency requirements that are already in place, actually, California has requirements, and now the NASDAQ situation, I think that we are going to not only see more transparency, but more conscious efforts to ensure that you're on the right side of that issue, especially since class action lawsuits are being filed against companies who don't have diverse boards, shareholder derivative suits saying, you have this stuff on your website about diversity and inclusion, and here in this lawsuit, we pictured every man on your board. And some of these complaints will have like a throwback picture from like 1950 something of the board, and then the pictures of the board today, and they're all old white men. So I do think that there's going to be a big shift in board representation that does not necessarily translate into how to diversify your workforce. And that's because the protections of the discrimination laws are universal, which means you can't discriminate against men or white individuals just as you can't discriminate against women or minority individuals. And so when competing for an actual opportunity like a job, you can't simply prefer somebody because of the color of their skin. If the two people are equally qualified, those decisions have to be merit-based unless there's a lawful affirmative action plan in place, which is a subject for a whole nother panel. But in terms of the board, yes, a lot of companies are actually already being more transparent about everything because investors are demanding it, customers are demanding it, clients are demanding it, and we're seeing a lot of requests coming into our clients that basically ask for the companies to disclose their diversity statistics or to say what they're doing on the D&I front. And we're seeing that as a law firm with our own clients demanding more information about what we're doing to be more diverse and inclusive as a law firm.
I know our hour is quickly coming to an end, so I just wanted to stop here to see if any audience member has questions. And if you do, please post the questions on the Q&A. But we still have several questions prepared, so we'll move on to those. But as soon as we see something, Teresa, please let us know.
Okay.
The almost century-old movement to enact an equal rights amendment to the U.S. Constitution is once again getting attention, with advocates touting 2021 as the best opportunity in a generation to move the measure from political purgatory to reality, given, among other factors, the record number of women serving in Congress, America's first ever woman vice president, and the Democrats' current political majority in Washington. The Biden-Harris administration has said that enacting the ERA is a centerpiece of its agenda for women, and Vice President Harris has said that the measure is a priority of her first 100 days in office. What do you think the chances are for passing the ERA?
Well, that is a great question. And, the timing in politics is so important. And the ERA seemed like it was a great idea at the wrong time because it was ahead of its time. You can't get too ahead of the people. When people read the ERA and they say, but isn't this already law? Didn't we pass this, 20 years ago? Are we still talking about this? Because it's become a lightning rod now, pitting conservatives against liberals. Never mind what it says would be something that you could easily pass. And you could ask people on the street, what do you think about this law or this constitutional amendment? They would say, yeah, I'm sure it's already passed, and it passed many years ago, but it hasn't. And I remember seeing photos of Betty Ford with the wife of Republican President Gerald Ford with a big button saying "Pass the ERA now." I cannot imagine a high-level Republican office holder's wife with an ERA button, because it's associated now with liberal causes. Never mind the fact that it could easily pass. No one would be against it. It makes perfect sense. But most people think, hey, women have made all of these great strides that we've been talking about for an hour. So why do you need the ERA? But it's we've had problems with deadlines, and you need to get it ratified in 7 years, and you move the deadline. Anyway, it's been a real mess. I think it could pass. It makes sense, but there's a lot of political lightning related to it based on what went on in the past. You ask a young person today about it and they go, yeah, of course. Isn't that already happening? Arshi and Esther, what are your thoughts? Could it happen? Could we pass it?
I'll jump in, and then Esther, I'll turn to you. I think that the politicization piece that you referenced, Ileana, that's key. Because, when you look at the context of the tight margins we're looking at, the House recently passed it I want to say almost a week ago. And now we're in a situation where does this go in the Senate? Probably nowhere. And I think that goes to the fact that unless there are one of two things, one is that somehow this issue becomes rebranded on the Republican side so it isn't so political, or there's a really significant Democratic majority where you do have enough votes where things aren't tight and things aren't, kind of one of those pieces where you need Republican votes for almost anything you do. So I think in this environment, it certainly is outside of reach overall. Esther, I'll turn the mic over to you as we're closing up our hour.
Sure. I mean, in terms of the likelihood of the Equal Rights Amendment passing or not passing, you two are much more well situated to opine on that than I am. But in terms of Ileana's point about, well, why do we need this? Don't women already have the same rights as men? Like, haven't we crossed this bridge in the 60s, with the passage of Title VII and other anti-discrimination laws that protect gender. But there are a couple problems with the existing framework. The one is that, at least as interpreted by the Supreme Court, gender is intermediate scrutiny, whereas race is strict scrutiny. So women aren't, any sort of law that a state or government is going to pass that imposes a burden on women is only subject to intermediate scrutiny rather than strict scrutiny. And the amendment would resolve that, and it would be strict scrutiny for gender classifications as well. And the other issue is that the protections that are in place right now are acts of Congress that can be changed, rescinded, amended. The likelihood that gender discrimination would be eliminated from Title VII is nil, but at the same time, it's not a constitutional right, it's a statutory right that can be revised and interpreted by the court, which can't happen with a constitutional amendment. And what I read, even though I'm having trouble reconciling this in my brain as accurate, is that if the Equal Rights Act were passed, or Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution were to go into effect, that discriminatory effect against women would be protected more strongly under existing laws than it currently is protected. So in other words, laws that under the current framework of Title VII, you have to treat pregnant women as the same you would anybody who has any sort of work-related disability. It's equal treatment, not preferential treatment, even if a neutral law on its face is having a disproportionate effect on women that are pregnant. And so in one way, the commentators are saying that the amendment would potentially broaden those protections to discriminatory effect. And the same with pay. If we can't get the Paycheck Fairness Act passed, that if there was a constitutional amendment, pay practices that are neutral on their face, but that disproportionately impact women could be unconstitutional. It would be another line of attack. So we'll see.
Barbara, you did a great job herding these three cats.
It's been a very, very interesting hour, very thoughtful conversation. And I'm sorry that the hour went by so quickly because we have still so many questions.
And we had some great questions in the chat, but we'll need more time. We'll have to do part 2.
Well, thank you all. Especially thank you to the panelists, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Listeners, you've been listening to the Biden-Harris administration's Agenda for Women, featuring moderator and funds partner Barbara Niederkofler and panelists labor and employment partner Esther Lander, public law and policy partner Arshi Siddiqui, and senior advisor and former Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen. To learn more about the firm's thinking on the Biden-Harris administration's actions and executive orders, search those terms on akingump.com and take a moment to read the panel participants' bios. Until next time. On Air with Akin Gump is presented by Akin Gump and cannot be copied or rebroadcast without consent. The information provided is intended for a general audience and is not legal advice or a substitute for the advice of competent counsel. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. The content reflects the personal views and opinions of the participants. No attorney-client relationship is being created by this podcast, and all rights are reserved.